She walked right past dozens of armed guards into a billionaire mafia wedding just to look the groom in the eye and ask why she wasn't worth fighting for. He had just said, "I do to a crime princess to unite two deadly dynasties." But when he saw the woman he actually loved standing on the terrace in the rain, the ruthless mob boss looked absolutely terrified. And then he told her the sick, twisted truth. Pause the frame right here. The clock glows 3:47 in the morning. The camera lingers on Celine, trapped in the cold blue light of the television. She watches Roman Duval, the man for whom she torched her entire existence, marrying someone else on a live broadcast. Rain lashes against the glass, masking the quiet devastation in her eyes. Beside her sits a packed suitcase, heavy and still as a gravestone. Roman promised her freedom, but gave her a sterile wire transfer and an order to disappear. The family patriarch pulled the strings, erasing 6 months of blinding love. You and I are going to unpack this together. Because the painful truth we all must learn is that sometimes our most shattering betrayals are exactly what we need to finally wake up. To understand how we arrived at this nightmare, we must pan the camera back. Boston Metro Trauma Bay, 2 in the morning. The air is thick with the sharp sting of bleach. Celine stands at the metal sink, 9 grueling hours into her shift. Without warning, the double doors crash open. 2 men in dark suits drag a third figure into the harsh light. He is bleeding heavily, his shirt soaked red, yet his jaw is locked tight. He wears a lethal bullet wound like a minor inconvenience, his eyes perfectly flat. The simple lesson here is that true danger rarely announces itself with chaos. It walks in with a terrifying, unnatural calm. One of the men barks orders, his gaze hollow. Hospital protocol evaporates instantly, replaced by a suffocating wave of raw dominance that floods the small room. You and I must watch this next sequence closely, because this is the exact second the trap snaps shut. The attending doctor spots a weapon beneath their jackets and instantly backs away. Protocol demands calling the authorities. But the bleeding man cuts through the panic with one chilling stare. "No police," he commands, his pulse remains steady while crimson pools on the white floor. In this heavy silence, Celine makes a choice that seals her fate. She steps into the glare and says she will save him. We so often mistake our own foolish bravery for strength, completely unaware that we are just unlocking a cage to pet a starving wolf. The men drop his heavy frame onto the surgical table. Give her a strict 30 minutes, and barricade the heavy doors. She is entirely alone with the dark. The camera pushes in on her trembling hands. Her medical conditioning completely overrides her survival instincts. Celine grabs the trauma shears, cutting the ruined fabric away from his chest. The metal is buried dangerously close to his collarbone, just a fraction of an inch from a fatal bleed. As she reaches for the pain medication, his blood-soaked hand shoots out and locks like a vice around her wrist. It is a silent, terrifying display of control. "No anesthesia," he commands. His deep voice does not shake. The harsh lesson here is that those raised in relentless violence can never afford the luxury of letting their guard down. Celine tries to reclaim her authority, warning him of agonizing pain, but the air grows heavy, and it becomes brutally clear she is no longer in charge. He locks his hollow eyes with hers and simply orders her to work fast. This stubborn refusal to surrender control reveals the deeply fractured architecture of his mind. Celine accepts the liability, plunging her tools into his torn flesh. Her heart batters frantically against her ribs, yet her hands move with steady grace. She scrapes metal against bone, and he does not let out a single gasp. He remains entirely detached from his own physical agony. The tragic truth of life is that we often build massive walls to protect our fragile souls, only to realize we have accidentally entombed ourselves alive. Desperate to ground the spinning room, Celine tries to force a human connection. She asks for his name. He asks if it really matters. "I am inside your chest," she replies, using dark humor as a desperate shield. "Freeze the frame right here." A shadow of amusement cracks his marble facade. "Roman," he whispers. She offers her name, and his mind dissects it. "Celine, the goddess of the moon. Your parents were optimistic. The psychological stripping has begun." She mentions her mother's love for myths, dropping the bloody bullet into a basin with a hollow clang. "Yours clearly favored empire builders." She fires back. The lighting shifts as her barb strikes a buried nerve. His jaw flutters. "They favored legacy." He corrects her, his voice heavy with expectation. A sobering reminder for us all is that the heaviest chains in this world are the family legacies we never asked to carry. Celine finishes the sutures in silence. "Do you do this often?" she asks. He simply looks away, hiding his truth. Let us look at this delicate dynamic together. The surgery is over, yet his predatory gaze remains fixed upon her. He watches her like a starving wolf. "Thank you," he rasps. Celine attempts to pull up her clinical armor. "Do not thank me," she commands. "Just avoid dying on my watch." The camera pushes in as their eyes lock. A heavy tether snaps tight in the dim room. Two violently isolated souls, drowning in trauma, recognizing one another. The ultimate danger in life is never the obvious enemy we fear. It is the broken soul who inexplicably feels like home. The guard signals it is time to leave. Roman slides off the table, pulling his ruined shirt over his broad shoulders. He pauses at the door, noting her lack of frantic questions. Why waste the oxygen? She breathes into the quiet void. 72 hours later, the quiet grooming phase begins. 24 pristine white roses arrive anonymously at the ward. A colleague assumes it is a sweeping romance. Celine coldly deflects, attributing the gift to a grateful patient. But ordinary gratitude is a simple paper card, not an opulent floral fortress. By the third week, the shadows deepen. A bottle of vintage 2015 wine is delivered. It is a calculated demonstration of his terrifying reach. Celine's fingers trace the dark glass, finding a single cursive letter etched into the label. The letter R. The tragic reality of human nature is that we often ignore glaring warning signs because the thrill of being chosen is too intoxicating. She knows she should throw the bottle away to protect her peace. Instead, she hides it in the dark. You and I are going to unpack this pivotal misstep together. Celine is a brilliant physician, logic demands. She surrender this illicit gift. Instead, she carries that heavy bottle onto her rusted fire escape, uncorks it in the rain, and drinks the velvet poison. When Roman emerges from the deep shadows of the concrete garage, the steel trap snaps shut. He leans against a black sedan worth more than her entire existence, radiating the coiled tension of a predator. She accuses him of stalking her, but he smoothly frames it as a gentle gesture of gratitude. Here is our shared tragic flaw. We falsely believe that merely identifying a red flag makes us immune to its venom. We forget that simply lingering in the dangerous blast radius is always enough to ensure our absolute destruction. Celine fiercely convinces herself she is unafraid, believing the trauma bay has incinerated her fear. Roman merely offers a low rumbling laugh. The sound is warm, but make no mistake, a predator's warmth is just an adaptive tool engineered to pacify prey. He smoothly suggests dinner. When she declines, he pivots to a rundown local diner. It is a brightly lit public arena, providing the intoxicating illusion of safety and control. Betraying every survival instinct screaming in her blood, she agrees to a single hour. She does not realize she is being hunted. She only feels the rare high of being truly seen. The great tragedy of the human heart is that our starvation to feel special entirely blinds us to the iron teeth of the trap. We end up eagerly thanking the very man holding our chains. Stick with me on this scene, because the visual contrast is everything. The diner is a decaying relic, bathed in flickering neon and the bitter scent of scorched coffee. Celine chose this purgatory to assert her dominance. Roman looks out of place in his tailored dark suit, yet he manipulates this to project a false adaptability. He declines the menu, whispering that her presence is all he craves. When she pushes back, he tastes the stale pie and grimaces. It feels like an endearing human flaw, but this is the exact poisoned soil where a toxic bond takes root. He fabricates vulnerability to lower her heavy guard. The life lesson here is chilling. True monsters almost never arrive with their fangs bared. They arrive wearing the gentle, patient smile of someone who simply wants to listen. Freeze the frame and analyze the silent war beneath their dialogue. Roman is orchestrating a masterclass in psychological interrogation, veiled as a casual date. His eyes track every shift in her posture, cataloging her confessions to construct an artificial intimacy. As the patrons filter out into the rain, Celine's intuition finally shrieks at her to flee. She abruptly states she must leave. Logically, she should walk out and erase his existence. She is sharing a booth with a lethal shadow. Yet, beneath the sickly yellow hum of the lights, a dangerous spark ignites. She hesitates, offering a soft, maybe the cruelest truth of our condition is this. Chronic exhaustion shatters our defenses. When your soul is starving for warmth, even a beautifully painted fire looks like salvation you cannot refuse. Let us look at the quiet cruelty of this opening scene. Roman brings her to a penthouse rooftop, framing the moment like a cinematic dream. Silver catches the string lights, while the city glitters far below. It is a staggering display of power, meant to completely overwhelm her logic. Over expensive wine, he casually drops carefully chosen pieces of his broken shed. He talks about studying history, about wanting to be an architect. He frames himself as a survivor, not a cartel boss. It is a perfectly constructed illusion. The hard lesson here is simple. When someone bombards you with a massive show of affection right at the start, it is rarely about real love. They are just building a debt so huge. You will spend your life trying to pay it back. We are essentially watching a heartbreak in slow motion. Pay attention to how the shadows deepen as Celine walks directly into his trap. She carries that heavy burden so many healers do. Losing her mother at 16 left her desperate to fix every broken person who crosses her path. Roman reads her vulnerabilities like an open book. He drops his voice to a strained, breathless whisper, playing the part of a tragic, lonely king, ruling over a cursed empire. When she gently brushes her fingers against his knuckles, she has no idea she is sealing her own fate. The truth we all have to learn is that empathy is a beautiful, fragile thing. But if you hand it to someone who has no intention of returning it, it just becomes the weapon they use to destroy you. The camera slowly pushes in on a quiet morning, but the tension hanging in the air is unbearable. The warning signs are literally flashing in the background, dark cars waiting on her street, quiet threats echoing in the hallway. The terrifying image of him casually tucking a gun into his waistband before they even have coffee. Celine is a highly intelligent doctor, yet she mentally edits the scene, completely erasing the monster in her kitchen. She only lets herself see a lonely, misunderstood man eating leftover noodles on her couch. It shows just how fragile our minds really are. The reality of life is that we will often rewrite the most dangerous truths just to protect our own hearts, falsely believing that our love alone is enough to cure someone else's darkness. Fast forward 2 months later, 3 in the morning. The bedroom is soaked in cold, blue light, and the trap finally snaps shut on her. Roman executes his masterstroke. Staring blankly at the ceiling, he whispers how much he hates his own life, spinning a tragic story about an inescapable family curse. He strips away the image of the ruthless crime boss and replaces it with a helpless, scared child. But that dead, flat tone of his voice, that is entirely calculated. Celine rests her hand on his chest, practically trading her own soul to promise him peace. You and I need to see the absolute danger hiding in this moment. The most dangerous people do not keep you trapped by making you afraid of them. They do it by making you feel sorry for them, turning your pity into a prison. Just watch Celine's face during this embrace. She feels a slight shake in his shoulders, a tiny hint of panic he deliberately lets her see. She truly believes she is comforting a terrified man, completely blind to the endless hungry void inside him. He is not offering her a safe place to land. He is dragging her into the intoxicating rush of his own ruin, planting the seeds of a massive trauma bond. But daylight always ruins the illusion. The shadows turn into real threats, black cars, following her to work. Dangerous men watching her every move. In the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital, her friend Ivy tries to shake some sense into her. Life teaches us a very harsh lesson here. Closing your eyes to a real danger never makes it go away. It just guarantees you will get hurt. Notice the frantic way her hands shake as she tries to defend him. Celine fights Ivy with everything she has, swearing Roman is gentle, and completely ignoring the trail of violence he leaves behind. Ivy is the only person seeing the wolves circling them. Celine is way past genuine love at this point. This is a pure chemical dependency. Even the thought of being away from him causes her physical pain. It is no longer romance, it is an addiction to the madness. When Ivy forces her to choose between survival and him, Celine instantly speeds off to the foggy docks to find his car. It is a lonely, pathetic image. The painful truth about human nature is that when you force someone to choose between their toxic addiction and their best friend, the poison always wins. Let us take a closer look at this exact moment on the docks. Celine is practically begging for a way out, just a chance to breathe normally again. Roman simply stares out at the freezing water and casually offers to kill the men following her, completely missing her basic human need to just feel safe. When she pushes him to take real responsibility, you can see the muscles in his jaw clench. He hides behind fancy, dramatic words like legacy and succession, trying to make his bloody work sound like a noble sacrifice. Celine pushes back, demanding the honest truth. Instantly, the warmth vanishes from his eyes, and he shuts her out completely. The life lesson here is unavoidable. You can never build a stable, peaceful home with someone whose entire identity is constructed out of lies. This is the exact moment she finally pierces his armor. Celine looks him straight in the eye and forces him to face facts. He is either a helpless prisoner of his family, or he is just a coward. It is a powerful confrontation. Men like Roman absolutely thrive on playing the victim, constantly crying over the prison they built with their own two hands. For one painful second, you actually see a flash of real regret in his eyes. Celine reaches out her shaking hand, offering him a real way out of the darkness, but then his phone rings, shattering the moment entirely. The vulnerability dies on the spot. He puts the mask of the untouchable crime boss back on and leaves her in silence. We must remember that deeply ingrained habits will always kill off a brief moment of bravery. A few nights later, the lighting shifts to an unhealthy, sickly yellow. Roman forces his way into her apartment, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He immediately starts spinning his next massive lie. He claims the streets are at war, and the only way to stop the bloodshed is for him to marry into a rival family. Celine, barely holding on to her sanity, begs him to just walk away from the criminal life entirely. Instead, he puts on the martyr's crown. He hides his own deep cowardice by acting like he is sacrificing his happiness for the greater good of the city. It is a classic move from a deeply broken ego. If there is one thing we should take away from this, it is this. A person who constantly blames the universe for their own terrible choices will eventually destroy you. His massive ego absolutely swallows the entire room. He actually believes the city will fall apart if he is not the one running it. But the camera stays focused on Celine, and for the first time, she sees everything clearly. She realizes there is no one guarding her back to him. She is completely disposable. Feeling his control slipping away, Roman pulls out the cruelest trick in the book, the fake future. He holds her face, desperately asking for just 14 more days. He promises they will run away together. A beautiful lie meant only to keep her sitting in that chair. Tragically, she actually listens. She sees the fire burning down her life and still negotiates with the man holding the match. The hardest lesson is that blind, desperate hope is always what ruins us in the end. The tragic irony of this sequence is genuinely hard to stomach. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Celine gives in and swallows the lie of a grand getaway. Just as her walls finally crumble, Roman drops the heaviest weight he has. He looks at her and says he loves her. By using that exact word, at her weakest moment he guarantees her blind, unquestioning loyalty. After that, the days just blur together, but his emotional vanishing act starts immediately. You can see the physical distance between them growing in every wide shot. His texts become cold, empty updates. He is carefully weaning himself off her, setting the stage to cut her loose. We have to face a very ugly truth here. Dragging out a goodbye does not make it hurt less. A slow betrayal still leaves a scar. The internal war tearing her to pieces is almost too painful to watch. Her body clearly knows what is coming, which is exactly why her hands shake so badly as she packs a small suitcase. But her mind is still drowning in that toxic dependency. The 12th day. The silence is deafening. Roman stops calling entirely, using that familiar punishing silence to finally break her. Then the real blow lands. A news alert pops up, showing photos of Roman smiling and drinking in his violent, wealthy world. Staring right at the visual proof of his betrayal, Celine just freezes. She hurls the phone across the room, violently refusing to accept reality. Life shows us that the mind will totally deny an obvious betrayal, just to keep the human heart from shattering completely. We have finally reached the last, crushing scene of this tragedy. On day 14, the exact day Roman swore they would run away together, Celine is sitting completely alone in an empty house miles from the city. The rain taps against the glass like a ticking clock, slowly draining the last of her hope. Midnight comes and goes in total silence. At 2 a.m, her phone lights up with one cold text, telling her to check the news, and there it is. Roman is standing under the bright cathedral lights, marrying Celeste. His father managed this entire cruel masterpiece from the start. The screen cuts to black on Celine's ruined face, the final, brutal lesson of this story. There are people out there who will happily build their golden lives right on top of your ruined devotion. Let us focus the lens right here on Celine. Watch her micro-expressions. The exact second her reality shatters, the harsh blue screen illuminates her face in the dark room. It is a final text from Roman, a cold wire transfer meant to make her disappear. In this brutal underworld, affection is a liability, a loose thread easily snipped with a payoff. But look closely. Not a single tear falls. The warm hope in her eyes hardens into black ice. She refuses the role of the weeping victim. Grabbing her leather coat, she throws open the door to the howling, rain-soaked night. She is going to make him look her in the eyes and own his betrayal. Because the truth is, sometimes the only way to take your life back is to walk directly into the jaws of the monster that tore you apart. She has no plan and no invitation. Instead, she dials Luca Reiner, a low-ranking syndicate soldier who owes his brother's life to her medical skills. 20 minutes later, his headlights cut through the downpour. Luca looks terrified, asking if she is certain about this suicide mission. She shakes her head no, but an unstoppable grief propels her forward. Through the rhythmic slapping of the wipers, the Laurent estate rises from the cliffs, a fortress of old money and fresh blood. You and I should really look at Luca here. His hands tremble on the wheel, trapped between a moral debt and his dread of the cartel. It is a tragic, unavoidable reality we all face. Debts of the heart are almost always paid with the currency of our deepest fears. The engine clicks off, leaving only the sound of rain drumming against the roof. Luca rubs his face, the dashboard shadows, making him look hollow and aging him 10 years. He warns her that crashing a mafia wedding to confront a new boss is a guaranteed death sentence. Notice the sheer weight of his panic. He is paralyzed by the syndicate, yet shackled by his gratitude to her. He nods once, declaring that after tonight, their ledgers are wiped clean. They step into the freezing storm, the icy water instantly biting through her clothes. As they walk toward the guards standing at the service door, the tragedy is unmistakable. Loyalty in the underworld is a heavy iron anchor, and it inevitably drags everyone attached straight down to the bottom. Luca steps up, his voice steady, as he tells the armed men, Celine is here for a secondary security sweep. The guard narrows his eyes, stepping dangerously close to inspect her face. You can almost hear the frantic hammering of her pulse, but instead of breaking, she weaponizes her past years of suppressing terror during fatal hospital codes, harden into a cold, unbreakable mask. She locks her gaze onto his, unblinking, and casually names Castellano, the ruthless head of cartel security. It is a massive psychological gamble, perfectly exploiting the guard's fear of his bosses. He steps aside, and the heavy steel door latches behind them. The brutal truth of the matter is that sometimes your deepest, most painful traumas forge the exact armor you need to survive. The air inside the service corridor is suffocating, smelling of expensive truffles and sharp adrenaline. Luca grips her arm, whispering they have 10 minutes before the security rotation is audited. He searches her eyes and finds only a chilling emptiness. The realization hits him hard. Her instinct for self-preservation is totally gone. That is the devastating nature of heartbreak. It silences the rational mind, replacing survival with one destructive mission. He points toward an old gallery high above the floor. They slip through the dimly lit halls, moving like phantoms past grotesque displays of stolen wealth. It is a dangerous reality we must all face. When profound grief takes the steering wheel, simple logic is the very first passenger thrown out the window. The atmosphere itself feels poisonous, a crushing density of corrupt power that presses against the lungs. Luca works the heavy brass lock of the gallery door, pulling her onto a dark, dusty balcony. Watch his body language. He is only 25. A fundamentally decent kid swallowed by a merciless life. He steps back, his chest heaving. He whispers that this is where he gets off, begging her to remember that these men do not negotiate. They simply erase problems with fatal precision. Then, his survival conditioning takes over. He melts back into the shadows, leaving Celine utterly alone in the dark. It is a harsh, unbending law of nature. You can never approach an apex predator expecting mercy, nor can you buy your safety using the fragile, worthless currency of human empathy. From that dusty balcony, Celine watches the tragic theater unfold across the polished marble below. Syndicate elites clink glasses, hiding their bloodlust behind string quartets and champagne. In the center stands Roman, his black tuxedo sharp next to his new bride. Focus closely on Roman's face. He smiles down at her, and the horrifying part is that his warmth looks entirely genuine. He is flawlessly mirroring her happiness. Weeks ago, he played the fiercely protective lover to Celine. Tonight, he is the devoted husband to someone else. It is a chilling, seamless display of psychological fracture. The lesson here is terrifying. A master manipulator rarely fakes his emotions. He simply studies your deepest desires and perfectly mirrors them back to construct your beautiful cage. She stays hidden for 20 agonizing minutes, watching the man she loved move through a room of killers alongside his father Vittorio. He is an aging titan whose violent approval Roman craves. Then the script fractures. Roman's posture stiffens. He excuses himself, pushing open the glass doors and stepping into the freezing rain. No coat, no guards. It is a silent, magnetic invitation. Celine's rational mind goes completely dark. She finds a narrow stone staircase and descends. Notice how the setting shifts from the warm gold of the ballroom to the unforgiving gray of the cliffs as she steps into the downpour. The truth of the matter is clear. Finding true closure rarely means discovering peace. More often than not, it demands walking entirely unprotected into a violent storm. Stick with me, because we are witnessing the complete collapse of a narcissist. Celine crosses the whetstone, forcing him to face her. When he turns, a catastrophic freeze takes over his body. The terror in his eyes is not about physical danger. It is the crushing weight of moral accountability. His two separated realities have violently collided. He tries to regain control, frantically whispering about cartel guards to dodge her questions. But Celine cuts through his deflection, demanding to know what she was actually worth. Roman finally shatters, his voice cracking as he swears his love was genuine. Here is the most devastating life lesson of all. Realizing that an abuser truly loved you, while systematically destroying your life, is a terrifying truth that will haunt you forever. The camera frames them against the raging black ocean. We have reached the final discard phase. Celine stands trembling in the rain, confronting the absolute void of his empathy. She abandoned her entire existence for him, only to watch him marry an heiress. Roman's defense remains perfectly consistent. He deflects all blame onto the pressures of his father's empire. When he flinches, it is not from genuine remorse, it is the sharp sting of a narcissistic injury. He despises being challenged. In that singular moment, the fog clears. Celine realizes he always had a choice. He simply preferred the crown over her devotion. The bitter lesson is undeniable. You can sacrifice your sanity to save a broken person, but you can never force them to choose your love in return. Let us pause the frame right here and examine the dark anatomy of this tragedy. Roman screams over the storm, confessing everything. His father found their escape plan and promised to torture Celine if he left. So, what did Roman do? He completely folded. He took the coward's exit, married the rival heiress, and made the woman he loved despise him just to keep her breathing. Hearing this, Celine tips her head back, letting out a hollow, agonizing laugh. The irony is suffocating. In his desperate attempt to protect her from a monster, Roman mutated into the exact same beast. You and I have likely learned this the hard way. The brutal reality is that the people who try the hardest to be our protective shield are often the ones who inflict the deepest, most permanent wounds. Picture the framing of this final shot. Celine stands tall against the storm, clinically dissecting his excuses. She forces him to see the blood on his hands. He is running the exact same playbook as his father, sacrificing her to keep the empire intact. Roman stares back, paralyzed by guilt. When she begs him to walk away from the mob, he whispers that he cannot. Celine tilts her head, her voice dropping to a lethal calm. She asks if he cannot, or if he simply will not. He tries to paint his cowardice as a grand, selfless sacrifice, but let's cut through the illusions. He loves her enough to want her breathing, but is too terrified to fight for her. Life teaches us a deeply cruel lesson here. Without the raw courage to face the fire, love is just another beautifully decorated cage. You and I need to pull the camera back and look at Celine before the shadows completely consumed her. She had a quiet life until Roman crashed into it, shattering her sanctuary. Now the frame tightens on her face. She stares down the man who fractured her mind. The very same man who swore devotion before marrying another woman just 6 hours later. Roman throws out hollow apologies, but she sees right through the performance. A cheap bandage cannot stop the bleeding when his crime family painted a target on her back. She wants him to confess the ugly truth. He was simply too terrified to burn his dark empire down to save them both. It is a bitter, timeless lesson we all eventually learn. Running away from your own demons will ultimately end up destroying the very people you claim to love the most. That accusation strikes him like a physical blow. The camera lingers on his trembling hands as his polished exterior crumbles into dust. He opens his mouth to deny her claim, but his chest heaves. His voice cracks under the weight of his racing pulse. Celine twists the blade deeper, her tone cold and steady. She reminds him that playing the obedient son is always easier than going to war. Right here in this dimly lit room, the tragic hero finally shatters. He confesses the horrific reality. He does not fear his own death, but the agonizing image of his father tearing her apart. He chose to play the villain to ensure her heart kept beating. It teaches us a heavy lesson. Merely keeping someone breathing is never the same as granting them a life actually worth living. Watch this agonizing sequence unfold. Roman finally admits he lacks the courage to let her walk away. The camera catches a sudden, shattering realization on her face. Beneath her blazing fury lies an ocean of suffocating grief. The true tragedy is that Roman actually believes his own fragile script, framing himself as a noble martyr As he reaches for her, she violently shoves him back, building an impenetrable fortress between them. Then he drops a truly pathetic confession. He risked a bullet to the head just to sneak into her wedding, desperate to look into her eyes and find hatred. He needed her punishment to absolve his own lingering guilt. The lesson here is clear and unforgiving. Deeply wounding, another person merely to bandage your own bleeding conscience is the highest form of selfishness. You and I are witnessing a masterclass in emotional destruction as Celine dismantles his delusion. Roman begs her to believe his noble intentions, but the lighting casts hollow shadows across his face. She knows he is only protecting his fragile pride. She lays out the cold facts, forced to choose between the woman he loved and the blood-soaked mob. He chose the mob. He weeps, claiming he would choose her with a gun to his head, but she utterly rejects his fake martyrdom. She delivers a piercing truth about devotion. True love means someone else matters more than your own safety and power. Roman collapses into heavy sobs, realizing his grand plan failed. He thought breaking her mind would save her life. It brings us to a harsh truth. Manipulating someone to protect them will only leave both of you in absolute ruins. Stay with me because we are approaching the exact frame where a trauma bond permanently snaps in two. Celine delivers the fatal blow. By deciding she was too fragile for his dark reality, he destroyed their future without even giving her a choice. The camera captures his physical recoil. He stumbles backward into the shadows, begging her to flee, but she sees right through the projection. He is the one suffocating under his family's grip, yet remains too paralyzed to break the chains. As she condemns him for choosing his father's violent chessboard, the atmosphere shifts. A cartel enforcer glides onto the terrace, like a predator scenting blood in the water. The timing is a cruel cinematic irony. It teaches us a brutal reality. You can never construct a peaceful home inside the borders of a deadly war zone. The lighting seems to drop 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. The enforcer locks his dead eyes on Celine, his hand sliding toward the cold steel under his jacket. Roman abruptly breaks from his weeping. He throws his body into the space between them, barking a desperate command. The tension hums like a live wire. The guard weighs his loyalty to a terrifying father against the son's fleeting spine. Finally backing away into the dark, the adrenaline vanishes, leaving Roman totally hollowed out by his own cowardice. He whispers that the streets will soon run red. In this quiet, breathless moment, the romantic illusion shatters entirely. She looks at the man she would have bled for, and sees only a hollow ghost. It is a chilling truth to remember. The person you love can vanish long before they actually walk out the door. Ripping away the romantic filters is the only way a protagonist survives this tragedy. Celine finally sees that her hero was just a fairy tale, written to disguise a rotting truth. The camera lingers on Roman, a broken, trembling boy standing in the freezing rain. He will always prioritize his own skin over true devotion. He possesses just enough heart to ruin hers, but lacks the spine to build anything real. As she turns her back, he hurls one final, desperate declaration of love into the wind. Celine does not even break her stride. She hears the emptiness echoing in his voice, walking away while the adrenaline still burns. We must carry this wisdom forward. Surviving means staring the ugly truth in the eye, instead of embracing a comforting lie. His noble sacrifice was simply cowardice in a tailored suit. The moment she steps beyond his toxic gravity, the cinematic tension breaks, and her emotional armor falls to pieces. Celine collapses into breathless sobs, mourning the ghost of a man she thought she knew. But the criminal underworld offers no intermissions for grief. A hand grips her shoulder from the shadows. It is Luca. His eyes dart frantically, operating on the pure, animalistic panic that keeps soldiers alive. He shoves her into an untraceable sedan, knowing they have tripped a fatal wire. As the tires scream against the wet asphalt, Luca shoots her a glance through the rearview mirror, silently asking if the closure was worth the immense risk. She nods as the estate fades to black. A profound lesson emerges here. Sometimes you must walk right into the fire to permanently burn away the chains of your past. You and I watch that sprawling mansion recede in the glass, looming like a marble tombstone for a decaying bloodline. Roman is already sinking back into his gilded cage, preparing for the marriage his father arranged inside the fleeing car. Celine whispers that she harbored a tiny ember of hope. Luca bluntly reminds her that hope offers no armor against hollow point bullets. The torrential rain beats against the roof, making the vehicle feel like a sinking coffin. Suddenly, the phone glows with an unknown caller. The voice that answers is not enraged. It is an icy, silken whisper that paralyzes the soul. Damien Duval. The mob kingpin shifts the very oxygen in the car. It is a chilling reminder for us all. The deadliest predators in nature never need to roar to make their prey freeze in absolute terror. The sheer weight of that name drains the color from Luca's trembling face. Damien skips the theatrical threats, launching a masterclass in psychological torture. With the flat delivery of a true sociopath, he recites their exact movements. Proving his eyes are everywhere, he paints a gruesome picture, promising that if Celine ever looks at his gun again, her death will be agonizingly slow. He orchestrates his words perfectly, designed to fracture her mind with sheer panic. Before he even lifts a blade, her body goes rigid, shutting down as she forces out a breathless surrender. He grants her exactly 24 hours to vanish from the earth. Then the line goes dead. The silence in the car is deafening. The lesson here is absolute. You can never sit at a table and negotiate with the devil. You can only run. Let us freeze the frame right here. You and I need to witness the exact second Celine accepts her old life is dead. Luca is drowning in panic, and in this underworld, a panicked soldier means the Reaper is already in the back seat. Her phone buzzes. $50,000 hits her account. Do not mistake this for romance. Roman sent that blood money because he is a coward, desperately trying to purchase a clean conscience after feeding her to the wolves. Celine's instinct is to hurl the cash back, clinging to her pride, but the script flips, revealing a brutal reality. When a monster tracks your scent, moral high ground will not buy a train ticket. She buries her ego and accepts the funds, learning a hard truth. Sometimes, sacrificing your righteous pride is the only possible way you survive the night. The camera zooms in on a map of Portland. It is the furthest edge of the country. Luca gives a grim nod, mapping out a cash-only ghost route to erase her digital footprint. But watch Luca closely in this quiet scene. When Celine asks if he will be safe, his shoulders drop in a helpless shrug. It is a textbook display of trauma bonding. He accepts his role as a disposable pawn, fully anticipating a brutal beating because that is just another Tuesday in the syndicate. Then, he delivers the most heartbreaking dialogue in the film. He warns her to sever the emotional cord entirely. Bleeding out grief, while in hiding, is like swimming with open wounds in a shark tank. If she clings to the romance, that mistake will be fatal. The lesson is grim but necessary. To survive the ultimate hunt, one must become entirely hollow. Look at the visual framing here. The cruelty is entirely deliberate. Celine was convinced her empathy could scrub the blood off a mafia prince. It is a trap we all fall into, right? Believing we are the magical exception to a lifetime of toxic conditioning. But inside his world, there are no exceptions, only fresh graves. Luca presses a bag of cash into her shaking hands and ghosts her, leaving one impossible instruction: stay alive. Watch her standing in the harsh, ugly glare of that bus terminal. The peeling walls mirror the absolute wreckage of her mind. The fairy tale is dead, and it leaves us with a simple, quiet truth to carry. You can never heal your soul inside the exact same slaughterhouse that just finished breaking you down. The camera pulls back to show us the absolute emotional wreckage. Celine gave up her safety for a man whose cowardice was always bigger than his capacity to love. Notice how she steps onto that rattling bus at 4 a.m, shedding her wet coat like dead skin. Catching her reflection in the cracked window, you actually see the final spark of hope die in her eyes. The compassionate nurse who thought she could fix him? She is gone. She burned away the moment he took another woman's hand. The face staring back is cold and scarred, but she is breathing. It points to a heavy life lesson we all have to face eventually. Surviving a deeply selfish person always means leaving a piece of your own soul behind in the ashes. The lens just lingers on her under the nasty hum of those fluorescent lights. Look at the rigid tension in her shoulders against that cheap plastic chair. 3:47 a.m. Every single time headlights wash over the wet pavement, she flinches. She is terrified Roman is going to bust through those doors. It has been barely 24 hours since the man she loved traded her for a political marriage. When the bus finally hisses open, she steps into the dark without glancing back at Boston even once. The crying is done. Now she is just a hollow shell. It is a quiet reminder of one of the hardest things we experience in life. Choosing to walk away from a beautiful lie rarely feels like a triumphant escape. Usually it just feels like grieving a death. You and I are going to unpack this together, because we know how these tragedies play out. The first rush of escape tricks you into feeling free, but it is really just the anesthesia of shock. Watch the amber streetlights wash across her pale face as the bus rolls down the highway. She is completely numb. Her mind cannot process that she is discarded and hunted, the perfect version of herself that Roman molded. That woman is dead. What sits under that cheap blanket is raw, naked survival. It teaches us a brutal but necessary truth. Real healing usually requires us to sit quietly in the absolute dark first. Years later, she will look back at the sound of these tires on wet asphalt as the exact moment she refused to be a victim anymore. Running 3,000 miles away is basically putting a bandage on a bullet wound. Portland greets her with a heavy, weeping drizzle that smears the neon signs in the puddles. It is late when she finally drags herself off the bus, completely alone. She rents a nasty Cashinley motel room. The shot gives us peeling wallpaper and a mattress that sags like a grave. You can practically smell the cheap bleach. She turns the deadbolt. Her shaking hands jam a wooden chair under the knob. She backs away. And right then, the adrenaline completely drains out of her. Her knees hit the stained carpet. The simple truth of the matter is unavoidable. The absolute hardest part of running from your past is the quiet moment you finally stop moving. And the pain catches up to you. The camera stays incredibly close on her face as the physical weight of this psychological war zone sets in. This is not just crying, it is a total collapse. She stays slumped against that scratched door, staring into the dark until morning light bleeds through the blinds. But with the dawn, the basic human urge to survive wakes up again. She buries the pain and rents a miserable apartment above a greasy diner, handing the landlord crumpled cash. No background checks, no emotional traps, no invisible strings controlling her. The room is barren, but the takeaway is profound. We often think peace has to look beautiful. In reality, sometimes peace is simply the quiet, heavy relief of being completely forgotten by the people who broke you. The shot slowly pans across her new reality, and you notice the room is set up purely for defense. A stained futon, cheap thrift store pans, nothing is here for comfort. It is just bare existence, but even ghosts need to eat. She knows a regular hospital job would alert Roman's syndicate, so she slips into a crumbling, underfunded clinic in East Portland. She sits across from Dr. Marcus Webb. The guy has these hollow eyes that look like he has not slept in a decade. He looks at her shaking hands and never even asks for her real name. He only cares if she can hold a needle steady. It is the quiet collision of two ruined people. The harsh beauty of hitting absolute rock bottom is that you finally meet others who know exactly how cold the floor really feels. Watch how she uses her own exhaustion as a weapon. The clinic is a non-stop blur of trauma and harsh lights. Celine grinds herself to the bone on purpose, working 16-hour shifts so her brain is too tired to process any memories. Standing under a dim bathroom bulb, she takes cold steel scissors and violently chops off her own hair. She dyes it pitch black and hides behind cheap glasses. Her clothes just hang off her thinning frame now. Looking into that cracked mirror, the sweet woman who trusted a monster is dead and gone. It serves as a really tough reminder about what survival actually demands. Sometimes, to make it out of a burning house alive, you have to burn down the person you used to be, even if it leaves you feeling completely empty. Stick with me here, because this is where the past catches up. 6 weeks of perfect silence go by then, right in the middle of stitching up a patient. Her hidden burner phone buzzes. Luca's name flashes on the screen. The camera captures her jaw clenching as she slips out into a wet alleyway. Over the static, Luca sounds terrified. Roman is tearing the city apart looking for her. The same guy who tossed her aside has spiraled into an absolute obsession, burning his own world to the ground just to find her. His manic need for control is about to shatter the quiet life she just scraped together. It exposes a really dark truth about toxic relationships. The exact people who break you will often demand the exclusive right to hold on to your shattered pieces. You can physically see the devastation hit her face. Standing in that freezing alley, Celine tries to stay strong, but Luca drops a massive truth bomb. Roman did not push her away to keep her safe. Damien, the crime family's ruthless patriarch, planned the entire betrayal. The old man leaked their secret to rivals on purpose, creating a fake crisis just to force his son into a profitable marriage. He treated his own son's heart like a poker chip. Celine's whole tragedy was manufactured. She gave up her life for a guy who was just a puppet on his dad's stage. It highlights a hard lesson about the cycle of hurt. Many times, the people who completely destroy our lives are actually just playing out the damage from a much larger, darker game of control. Let us step back and look at the twisted dynamics of this crime family. The real horror of being raised by a tyrant is not the violence, it is realizing you are just a tool in their toolbox, blinded by his own ego. Damien actually bragged about destroying his son's romance for profit, but arrogance always catches up to you. A quiet lackey recorded that conversation and handed the tape straight to Roman. Just imagine the blinding rage in Roman's eyes when he discovers his whole life is a lie. He beat his own father half to death in public, putting the old king on life support. The life lesson here is impossible to ignore. If you spend years treating a loyal heart like a weapon to be used, you cannot be surprised when it finally turns around and destroys you. Look at how fast an empire burns when the heir stops caring about the crown. Roman is running entirely on panic now. He tears up the arranged marriage contract, basically setting fire to his own legacy. His only goal is finding Celine, sending an army of trackers to hunt her down so she can grant him absolution. But keep your eyes on Celine's steady hands. She does not flinch. Damien might have rigged the game, but Roman still made the choice to drop her. He chose to let her go. That reality does not just wash away with regret. It points to a truth we all have to accept about forgiveness. A desperate apology almost never fixes the shattered glass. Most of the time, it just proves that you knew exactly how valuable the person was the moment you dropped them. Let us look closely at the trap closing around her. You and I have seen this trope before, but the framing here is entirely different. The camera lingers on Celine, bathed in the harsh cold light of a computer monitor. She is desperately begging an informant to scrub her digital footprint clean. Then comes the staggering revelation. Roman did not sell her out for ambition. His father weaponized a son's devotion, manipulating Roman into believing that breaking her heart was the only way to keep her breathing. The phone slips from her trembling fingers. She is terrified, but not of the crime syndicate. She is terrified of the pity suddenly blooming in her chest. Empathy is a beautiful, fragile instinct, right up until it becomes the very blade that destroys you. The lens shifts to Celine's new reality, capturing her desperate attempt to script an ordinary life. Even knowing Roman was an unwilling pawn in his father's ruthless game, the betrayal remains an open wound. She shatters her phone, burying herself in the sterile, blinding lights of a hospital ward. She plays the exhausted doctor flawlessly, but trauma refuses to be ignored. Weeks later, the quiet hum of the clinic stops entirely when a manager casually mentions a visitor from Boston named Ivy. The blood goes completely still in Celine's veins. Every step toward that waiting room feels like an agonizing march across a minefield. The dread is physically visible in her rigid shoulders. You can change your zip code, but you can never outrun the ghosts of your past. The visual contrast in this scene is absolutely striking. Picture Ivy, draped in expensive, flawless leather, sitting under the cheap, flickering fluorescent lights of a decaying clinic. She is a phantom from the opulent world Celine desperately fled. When the scene moves to Celine's crumbling apartment, the camera catches the raw, unfiltered horror in Ivy's eyes. Celine holds her chin high, claiming there is real salvation in this squalor, but the framing tells a completely different story. Celine is not saving the world here. She is simply building a tiny, miserable cage where she finally gets to hold the keys. It reveals one of the most painful ironies of human survival. The heavy iron walls we build to keep the monsters out usually just lock us inside with our own demons. Come with me, because we are about to watch the foundation of this story completely crack. Ivy did not travel across the country just to critique a cheap apartment. She delivers a quiet, devastating blow. The toxic patriarch is dead at 58. The official paperwork claims his heart gave out, but in the dark corridors of the syndicate, poison is a far more elegant weapon. Celine physically recoils, the breath leaving her lungs. Ivy leans in closer, suggesting Roman finally gathered enough venom to remove his father from the board, snapping his chain for good. She begs Celine to return to Boston, swearing the nightmare is over. But history teaches a ruthless lesson. When you slay the monster ruling the house, you only create an empty throne for a much angrier king. The camera cuts to the absolute carnage of Roman's newfound freedom. He is mercilessly purging his father's old loyalists, washing the syndicate's sins in blood. Yet, amid this brutal restructuring, his desperate obsession with finding Celine remains his final tether to humanity. Hearing this, Celine rolls her eyes, putting on a forced, theatrical display of apathy. But Ivy sees right through the performance. She knows Celine is paralyzed by a trauma bond. Forever tethered to the architect of her ruin, Ivy gently asks the dangerous question. What if Roman is a different man now? Celine's face instantly hardens. He broke when her life was on the line. A failure that cannot be undone. You can never build a secure fortress with a man who has already crumbled under the siege. Notice how the freezing rain lashing against the window mirrors Celine's internal emotional desolation. She narrows her tired eyes, demanding to know Ivy's true motive. Ivy holds her gaze, haunted by the memory of Celine shattering into pieces and fleeing into the cold night. Without raising her voice, Ivy exposes the lie Celine has been living. She is not truly alive, merely drifting through her days like a hollowed-out ghost. Ivy does not want a grand cinematic reconciliation. She just wants Celine to stand before Roman one last time, to sever those invisible chains for good. Celine violently rejects the idea, dismissing him as a coward who chose power over love. But the truth is unrelenting. Fleeing your fears does not cure them, it only allows them to hunt you from afar. Celine wraps herself tightly in a cloak of bitter rage, simply because fury is easier to survive than a shattered heart. But Ivy gently presses the wound anyway. Celine finally exhales, voicing the quiet terror that keeps her awake at night. What if Roman is the exact same monster, merely dressed in a sharper suit and whispering sweeter lies? Ivy offers a plain, simple lifeline. If he is, you turn your back and walk away forever. The camera lingers on Celine's exhausted face as memories flash behind her eyes. The leaked audio, the old boss playing God, Roman's slow descent into violence. Utterly drained of her fight, she nods, agreeing to face him. Ivy slides a room key across the table. Anger is excellent armor, but eventually, you must drop the heavy shield to actually heal. Before walking out the door, Ivy leaves one final, lingering image. Roman is entirely unraveling, consumed by the crushing weight of his own betrayal. Celine spends the next 2 days drowning herself in the exhausting routine of the clinic, desperate to silence the war raging in her mind. But on the third morning, her fragile illusion of safety shatters. A nurse casually mentions 3 men in tailored suits, asking quiet questions down in the lobby. The predators have found her. Her grand escape across the country has amounted to absolutely nothing. Panic tightens her throat as she faces the grim reality of her situation. You can run to the absolute edge of the earth, but you can never hide from a shadow. Avoidance is not a cure. It only delays the final, inevitable collision. With the walls of her life rapidly closing in, Celine finally makes the call. Her voice is steel, setting ironclad tips. They will meet in a crowded Seattle coffee shop called Zeitgeist, Saturday, high noon. She warns him that a single shadow of the mob will make her vanish into thin air. But the moment the line goes dead, a wave of dread crashes over her. It is that beautifully tragic human flaw, the urge to reach your hand back into the exact fire that scarred you. Why walk willingly toward the architect of your misery? She whispers the word, closure, like a desperate prayer. As she drives north, she fiercely rehearses her cruelty, forging her harsh words into armor. We beg the universe for closure, but we are often just seeking an excuse to rip the stitches out one last time. Stick with me here, and watch closely how the body always betrays a shattered mind. Celine presses herself into the darkest corner of the cafe, her eyes locked on the entrance like a condemned prisoner. 2 minutes to noon. Roman steps through the glass doors, and the sight of him is jarring. The flawless, untouchable mob prince is dead, his skin is ashen, his eyes sunken from months of sleepless agony. He approaches her table with agonizing slowness, treating the floor like a field of active explosives. He collapses into the chair without a single word. The raw, naked torment bleeding from his face sends a terrifying spike of pity through Celine's veins, and that is the lethal trap. Witnessing the person who broke you bleed is the quickest way to forget your own deep scars. The tension here is suffocating. Celine breaks the heavy silence with a whisper of defeated gratitude. Masking her vulnerability with dark humor, she diagnoses her presence as pure masochism, a desperate tactic to keep tears from spilling. The framing is brilliant. They sit in an aggressively ordinary cafe. Strangers sip at ease, completely blind to the psychological warfare unfolding at the corner table. Celine finally voices the dangerous question. Who murdered his father? The muscles in Roman's jaw violently twitch. He denies pulling the trigger, yet freely confesses his burning desire to do so. The tragic poetry of the underworld is simple. When you raise a son in the shadows of absolute cruelty, the suspect list for your murder includes everyone you ever claimed to love. Let's pause the film here. The true weight of their trauma bond is finally brought into the light. Roman lays out his grand, twisted design, speaking with the cold detachment of a man reading a ledger. He genuinely believed that shattering Celine's heart was the singular path to keeping her breathing. In his warped mind, isolating her made him the tragic hero. But Celine leans forward, delivering a blow that shatters his delusions. Stripping away her choices under the guise of protection was never love. It was just another elegant form of abuse. It is a bitter reality to swallow. You can never force a heavy shield upon someone who did not ask for it. True love demands the courage to stand in the terrifying dark together, rather than locking someone away in a gilded cage to keep them safe. Let us look at this scene together, because the physical ruin of Roman is truly staggering. The shadows beneath his eyes look like deep bruises of regret. Celine watches him, her muscles coiled tight, fully expecting a hidden dagger to finally strike. Instead, she finds a man completely hollowed out by grief. He makes the impossible promise, swearing to walk away from the crime syndicate and leave the blood money behind to become a ghost. Her immediate instinct is pure rejection, because a mafia predator does not simply turn into a civilian, yet this reveals the brutal tragedy of enduring severe trauma. When you spend years building heavy iron armor to survive a freezing winter, you completely lose the ability to feel the warmth of a real fire when someone finally tries to light one. Celine holds her ground, her voice sharp as broken glass as she calls his bluff. Men do not just resign from the underworld, but Roman looks up, his eyes terrifyingly clear. He admits his greatest fear is not a rival bullet. But looking in the mirror and seeing his father's cold stare looking back, Celine unloads her fury, hurling every lie, every moment of isolation, and every fractured piece of her sanity straight at his chest. You expect him to pivot and defend himself. Instead, Roman simply absorbs the blow. He bows his head, taking the full weight of her hatred, admitting he has zero right to ask for healing. It leaves us with a quiet, grounding truth. Real accountability means carrying the total weight of the destruction you caused, without ever expecting a pardon. The camera holds on the heavy, suffocating space between them. Roman drops his shoulders, quietly admitting he was a coward when it actually mattered. You can see the hot anger draining out of Celine, quickly replaced by a crushing grief for the normal life they will never get to experience. Desperate, she demands to know why he is playing the bleeding martyr. His answer hits with a sickening thud. He looks right at her, his tone dropping to an icy finality. She deserves a clean soul, he says, not some shattered disaster begging for grace. Life teaches us a very hard lesson in moments like this. Sometimes the people whose love burns the absolute brightest are the exact ones who have to walk away into the dark, just so we can finally learn how to breathe on our own. Stick with me, because we need to unpack the pure tragedy of this shot. Roman stands totally still in the freezing rain, taking all the blame. Celine shivers, demanding to know why he stalked her, if he genuinely wanted her out of his life. Slowly, he pulls out a photograph of her charity clinic. He only used his underworld connections to ensure his father's enemies were not hunting her. He saw her bright light and decided his greatest act of love was to completely erase himself from her story. Celine is paralyzed. She had prepared to fight a ruthless monster. The most earth-shattering shock is watching the villain willingly open the cage door. True love is sometimes having the quiet nobility to let someone walk free, rather than keeping them chained beside you. Watch this brutal paradox unfold right in front of us. Celine built impenetrable iron armor against his usual toxic behavior, yet she is completely defenseless against the quiet dignity of a clean goodbye. As Roman turns to leave, her mind violently short-circuits. She actually bolts after him into the relentless rain, her chest heaving as she screams the ugly truth of her shattered heart. She demands to know why he is giving up so easily. The broken corner of her trauma is desperately begging the exact man who destroyed her to turn around and fight a bloody war to keep her. It is a gorgeously tragic irony. Life patiently teaches us that the heaviest, most destructive chains are rarely the ones locked around our wrists. Usually, they are the ones we blindly refuse to let slip from our own bleeding hands. Roman halts, his dark silhouette rigid in the freezing rain. Celine spills her fractured soul onto the pavement, drowning in a mix of blind rage and desperate devotion. She yells that his grand exit is just a cowardly excuse to avoid the hard labor of real change. Roman turns around, the streetlights catching the pure agony in his face. He whispers that walking away is ripping him to shreds, a sacrifice made solely to buy her peace. Celine searches his eyes for a lie, but only finds a man reduced to total rubble. She admits she can never fully forgive him, but his absence is a weight she simply cannot bear. The ugly truth of survival is that we rarely get a pristine fresh start. Sometimes, we just have to learn how to breathe inside the blackened wreckage of what we lost. In sheer desperation, Celine pitches a tragic delusion. What if they just pretend to be complete strangers? Strangers whose deep scars just happen to align. It is a frantic attempt to rewire her nervous system and bypass the ruin he caused. The harsh lines of Roman's face finally soften into a tired smile, as if a massive anchor dropped off his chest. Her voice trembles, admitting she is too exhausted to hold on to her anger anymore. Her fingers slowly reach out to brush his wet coat, in seconds. They slip right back into the familiar warmth of their trauma bond. It breaks your heart to watch them walk off for coffee, burying their nightmares under polite smiles. The bitter truth is deeply human. We will gladly wrap ourselves in a comfortable lie, just to avoid the freezing terror of facing the world entirely alone. You and I have watched this dangerous dance before. The camera tracks them down the damp streets, physically leaning into one another to keep their bruised souls anchored. They hide in a dimly lit cafe, forcing down food after days of raw panic. The conversation is painfully hollow, a masterclass in dodging the buried explosives right between them. But this quiet peace is only borrowed time. Suddenly, the lighting shifts and Roman shatters the fragile illusion. His gaze sharpens into the cold, calculating stare of a predator, zeroing in on the finances of her charity. The warm air in the room instantly turns to ice. It serves as a haunting reminder. No matter how fast you try to run away, your darkest nature will eventually pull up a chair and sit directly across the table from you. Roman calmly offers to bleed his father's criminal empire dry, pouring every poisoned scent into her charity. Celine's posture goes rigid. She assumes he is just another mob prince trying to buy a clean conscience, but Roman cuts her off, his voice carrying the heavy weight of a confessional. He swears this is not about washing the blood off his hands. He knows the terror he caused her is an unpayable debt. Instead, he wants to surrender the darkest instruments of his family's violence, so she can forge them into something that saves lives. By handing over the vault, he strips away his own dominance. It is a powerful revelation. You can never erase the brutal damage you have done, but true redemption begins when you take your ugliest pieces and use them to build something undeniably beautiful. Watch the terrifying quiet grace of a master manipulator. Roman does not offer a weeping apology. Instead, he simply slides a blank check across the table. The camera pushes in on Celine's exhausted eyes. Her morals scream to reject the dirty cash, but her clinic is drowning. He is preying on her most vulnerable wound, her sheer burnout. She straightens her spine, laying down strict boundaries to project an illusion of control. Roman leans back with a slow, dark smile. He already owns the chessboard. When they shake hands, his fingers wrap around hers and linger 1 second too long. That physical touch is a calculated shock. The chilling life lesson is clear. Toxic power rarely kicks down the front door. It merely waits patiently in the shadows until you are simply too exhausted to remember to lock it. Let us look at how flawlessly he executes this. Roman calls his lawyer, effortlessly sweeping away the boundaries Celine just built. They spend an hour drafting contracts. This sterile paperwork creates a dangerous illusion of safety for her. It feels like two rational adults solving a problem without drawing blood. But you and I know this is the darkest magic trick, wrapping a target in a warm blanket. Right before the floor drops out on the street, the corporate armor melts away. Roman hesitates, his voice soft as he asks to see her again. Every survival instinct she has is shrieking. Here is the bitter pill. Forgiveness is beautiful, but blind trust is just trauma wearing a handsome mask sometimes. Our broken minds will dress up our absolute worst nightmares to look exactly like our deepest desires. The camera isolates Celine on the platform, freezing on the frame where her logic disintegrates. She is bathed in the hungry stare of a man raised by a monster. Roman watches her with that terrifying obsession his crime family is known for. Her instincts scream to flee, yet the deep trauma bond overrides her nervous system. Her breath hitches. She whispers for him to call her, leaning in for a reckless, desperate kiss. It is a tragic crash of profound grief and toxic attachment. As her train pulls away, the camera lingers on Roman. He is frozen on the concrete, his scarred face caught between agonizing despair and a poisonous hope. The devastating life lesson is simple. When a human soul is starving for one drop of genuine affection, the mind will easily justify standing directly in front of a loaded gun. The camera pushes in on Celine against the freezing window of a moving train. Her reflection stares back, hollow and exhausted. She just handed the keys to her life to a man who breathes pure danger. Marcus' warning echoes in her mind. You can sprint to the edge of the earth, but your shadow is always waiting. Can the son of a mafia kingpin truly scrub the violence from his own DNA? Can Roman abandon an empire built on blood? What we are watching is a brutal hostage fantasy. It is that desperate hope that love alone can stitch up a killer's fractured soul. She closes her eyes, sinking into a fatal daydream. The lesson here is devastating. We would much rather wrap ourselves in a warm, Comfortable lie, then stand unprotected in the freezing winds of the truth. Through the lens of her mind, the scene is painted in soft, golden hues. She pictures Roman washing his bloody mob money, completely clean, wiping his father's violent stain from the earth. But this is a fairy tale, entirely blind to the cold mechanics of the criminal underworld. 3 months ago, she would have scoffed at falling for a cartel boss. But here is a bitter truth you and I must swallow together. We are terrible at predicting the exact weight needed to snap our own breaking points. 6 days later, reality kicks down the door of her quiet clinic. Marcus walks in, holding a heavy envelope from a high-end law firm. He jokes about hitting a jackpot, completely blind to the live grenade resting in his hands. It is a surgical strike from a predator who knows exactly how to exploit her deepest wounds. The camera catches the tight, practiced smile she offers her patient, holding the expression perfectly until the heavy door clicks shut. Then, the facade completely shatters. She bolts into the suffocating dark of the supply closet to spring the trap waiting inside. It holds the lifeblood for a brand new foundation. $2 million down, $500,000 every year, giving her absolute control. Beneath the dense legal jargon lies a handwritten note from Roman, swearing there are no strings attached. But in this shadowy world, we know exactly how the tragedy unfolds. There is no free meal in the syndicate. This is blood money neatly wrapped in white silk. Her mind fractures. The life lesson here is chilling. Your ironclad morals will shatter the very second someone hands you the exact sum needed to save your world. Watch the mental gymnastics play out in her trembling hands as she signs her name, willingly binding herself back into his beautifully woven web. She convinces herself the blood on those bills will wash out if the money saves innocent lives. That night, her phone lights up the dark room. It is Roman. She hardens her voice, telling him his wealth cannot buy a doorway into her soul. But watch the master at work. His voice is a soothing hum, insisting the foundation is separate from their past. Then comes the fatal strike, he whispers. He just wanted to hear her voice, bringing up the ghost of their kiss in Seattle. She stammers a weak denial, but the lie hangs heavy. The brutal truth? We build towering fortresses to protect our hearts, only to leave the gates wide open for the single person who knows how to destroy us. The most terrifying aspect of this scene is his weapon of choice. He uses raw honesty like a serrated blade. When Celine asks how he plans to escape, Roman does not sugarcoat the truth. He paints a gruesome picture of severing ties with 6 crime families and waking the wrath of his father's loyalists. He even frames a recent car crash as a calculated hit. Look closely at the framing here. He casts himself as the tragic, bleeding soldier fighting the ghost of a tyrant. He knows she is a natural healer, and this vulnerability is a siren song she cannot resist. He begs for just 6 more months, playing her empathy like a master cellist. The terrifying lesson? The most lethal manipulators do not serve you lies. They serve perfectly carved slices of truth, making you bleed so much pity that you forget to save yourself. Let us step behind the camera and examine the architecture of this trap. Roman actually orders her to stay away. His voice drops into a whisper as he describes flying bullets, begging to keep her out of the crossfire. To Celine, this mirrors character growth. She assumes a man warning her of danger must be a safe harbor, but it is a flawless execution of reverse psychology. By offering an open door, he ensures she will slam it shut. Her knuckles turn white as she claims she still hates him. Yet she refuses to end the call. This is the agonizing poetry of the trauma bond. The warden hands the prisoner the keys, and the prisoner locks the cell from the inside. The bitter lesson? Self-awareness is not salvation. You can stare into the roaring inferno, perfectly understand the heat, and still march directly into the fire. The audio isolates their voices, fading out the world. For 2 surreal hours, they masquerade as an ordinary couple. They discuss her clinic and his empire, burying the shallow graves and night terrors under trivial banter. They construct a suffocating glass bubble. One weekly call mutates into a daily obsession. The juxtaposition is maddening. He casually murmurs about dodging assassins sent by his father's ghost, and she responds with worries about nursing schedules. 3 weeks later, he crosses into Portland, demanding to see her. Observe how silently the arsenic taints the well. The lesson here is bleak. We possess an alarming ability to normalize absolute madness. We will weave the most lethal threads into our daily routine, simply because the deafening silence of isolation is too much to bear. Every survival instinct screaming in her chest demands distance, but the trauma bond seizes the wheel, and she surrenders her location. The scene is framed against a weeping Portland sky by the river. Roman sits isolated on a bench, his mafia armor entirely stripped away. No armed guards, no tailored intimidation, just a weary man. Celine sits down, maintaining a strict 12-inch gap between them, a foolish barricade against a starving wolf. His dark eyes trace the new cut of her hair. Recognizing the universal symptom of trauma processing, she quietly confirms the money arrived, and here lies the tragedy's cruelest lesson. You can launder the stolen millions. You can swap the silk suit for a faded jacket. But you can never scrub the rot from a soul that was forged by a monster. The camera pushes in close for the emotional artillery. Celine whispers her dreams of expanding the clinic, and Roman instantly promises to flood her with more wealth. He waves the millions away like loose change, masking the cold steel of the handcuffs. Celine searches his dark eyes for deception, but finds only a terrifying, flawless sincerity. She demands to know his true endgame. He leans in, delivering the exact poison her fractured heart craves. He confesses his deep, lingering terror of losing her. A violent tremor of hope shakes her, though she warns him that proximity does not equal forgiveness. He accepts the condition with a rehearsed nod. The vital life lesson? You and I must measure a soul by the footprints they leave, not the poetry they speak. Words are effortless disguises for a predator to wear. Let us freeze the frame for a moment. Celine is far from naive. She understands that a poetic apology cannot magically rewire a killer's mind. She demands distance to test the integrity of his promises, and Roman, he drops his weapons immediately. He offers absolute surrender, bowing to whatever meager rations of contact she permits. It is a stunning masterclass in psychological warfare. Celine is drowning in her desperation to believe the monster has been slain. But the audience knows that decades of blood-soaked habits do not evaporate over a gloomy weekend. She resolves to test Sta's walls, praying for a resurrection, but here is the uncompromising truth. True redemption never arrives with sweeping declarations and dramatic lighting. It is forged in the grueling, invisible silence of daily, relentless choice. She issues her final ultimatum: if the predator resurfaces, she will vanish. Roman solemnly swears he has burned his old maps. In this exact frame, the microscopic cracks in Celine's armor become visible. It is the silent, fatal beginning of the end. Her trembling fingers bridge the gap, resting over his. Roman stares down at their hands like he is holding the last flicker of light in a collapsing universe. A suffocating silence hangs between them, heavier than any dialogue. As her taillights fade into the damp evening, Roman's face shifts into a mask of calculated agony. For 14 fleeting days she breathes easy, but mark this lesson down in stone. Do not confuse the eerie stillness in the eye of the hurricane for a clear sky. A true predator merely rests before the slaughter. The illusion of safety shatters with a deafening crack. Roman plays the phantom, perfectly, right up until Marcus drops the anvil the camera tracks. Celine's trembling hands, as she learns the feds are tearing into the foundation. As immaculate ledgers. They are circling like vultures. When Marcus confesses the agents explicitly chanted Roman's name, the color drains from her face. Her sanctuary collapses into ash. Marcus tried to absorb the blow, but the paper trail is stained with blood. The criminal rot has officially infected her world. Consumed by panic, she sprints home, slams the door, and desperately calls the devil himself. This is the tragic climax of denial. It does not matter how far you drive into the night. Turning your back on a toxic anchor will only ensure it drags you to the suffocating depths. Let the camera pull focus onto Roman and his rigid posture. The dead silence in this room feels heavy enough to crush a lung. The feds are dismantling his father's criminal empire, eyeing Roman for the throne. Celine stands before him, trembling with fury that her foundation might be seized as a mob front. He swore that money was clean, but a narcissist always justifies gambling with your safety. To keep his iron grip on her, Roman executes a terrifying manipulation. He pledges to testify against his own blood. You and I must look closely at this tragic frame. The lesson is undeniable. A person's true character is never revealed in the warmth of comfort. It is only laid bare when their back is shoved firmly against a cold, unyielding wall. By offering to betray the syndicate, Roman is signing his own death warrant. Celine stares at him, feeling the blood run freezing cold in her veins. The shadows deepen over the peak of this tragic, toxic bond. The man who ruined her life now gets to play the noble savior, whispering this is the only way to shield her clinic. Celine spirals, weeping, and wishing she could rewind time to reject his tainted money. She screams that his world is a suffocating black hole. Then Roman's voice shatters. It is a rare flash of vulnerability as he begs her to just trust him. Watch this trap carefully. When a master manipulator asks for your blind trust while standing on the edge of a cliff, they do not want to save you. They intend to drag you right over the precipice with them. The camera tightens on Celine's trembling hand. She demands to know why she should ever trust the architect of her ruin. Roman counters with twisted logic, claiming his love is her only shelter. She whispers that love is not enough, and hangs up. What follows is 3 agonizing days of suffocating radio silence. This is no accident. It is a calculated move designed to let her drown in panic. On the 4th morning, a friend tells her to turn on the television. The anchor drops a bombshell. Roman has officially flipped, trading his loyalty for federal immunity. The screen flickers with his image outside a courthouse. The tragic truth of this scene is undeniable. Silence from a toxic person is rarely empty. It is a psychological weapon, carefully forged to completely shatter your spirit. Bathed in the harsh television glow, Roman is framed as the ultimate tragic hero. The reporter confirms his testimony will dismantle the mob, clearing Celine's clinic. He traded his life for hers, cementing his toxic savior complex. Celine's knees buckle. Collapsing in shock, the shrill ring of her phone pierces the quiet. It is Luca, panicking. He warns that Roman just signed his death certificate, because the underworld never forgets. Luca begs her to stop him. Let us look at Celine's tangled mind together. You and I. She knows Roman is manipulating her life, yet she starts painting his betrayal as a romantic sacrifice. It is a heartbreaking reality. People will gladly romanticize their own mental prisons, provided the beautiful cage was crafted by the person they desperately love. The camera holds on Celine as Luca delivers the crushing blow. This suicidal sacrifice is exactly what she had demanded. The realization strikes her with physical force. Driven by a relentless trauma bond, she speeds into the night, forcing her way into his apartment. Roman looks like a hollow ghost. Instead of raging, Celine pulls him into a desperate, tear-soaked kiss. It is the chemical reinforcement of their tragedy pulling away. She screams that this rogue move will get him slaughtered. Roman offers a calm nod, perfectly weaponizing her own rule. He whispers he could not warn her, because she strictly forbade him from calling checkmate. Be incredibly cautious with the boundaries you establish. A master manipulator will always forge them into a brilliant weapon against you. Celine strikes his chest, sobbing and screaming at him to stop playing the tragic martyr. She begs for the right to make her own choices, watches body language carefully. Roman gently catches her trembling wrist. It mimics a soothing touch, but it is a chilling assertion of dominance. He validates her anger, then pivots back to his savior script. He murmurs he could never let his shadowed past poison her future. He is wrapping his own murder in the velvet ribbon of a romantic gift. Celine weeps, asking how to survive with that crushing guilt. His response is ice cold. He states her guilt is better than losing everything, because she loved him. Never forget this dark truth. The easiest way to erase a person's freedom is to convince them you are doing it solely for their protection. That freezing logic shatters Celine's mental defenses. She collapses against him, whispering she despises his choices, but hates herself even more for loving him. Roman pulls her close with hollow apologies. The camera tightens as he details the grim reality. Safe houses, armed marshals, grueling trials, and his identity wiped forever. She asks if he will hide alone. Roman plays the noble card, claiming he could never ask her to ruin her life by following him. Celine snaps back, stating she only asked for his plans, not an invitation. It is agonizing to watch. She is fighting for a tiny illusion of control inside a psychological trap he designed. True power is not forcing a captive to stay. It is masterfully tricking them into believing they hold the key to their own prison. Let us unpack this crucial pivot together. You and I, Celine pushes him, demanding he admit what he wants and ask her to stay. Roman performs a display of fake reluctance before giving her exactly what she craves. From the outside, the irony is blinding. He makes grand promises while standing in the wreckage of his violent choices. She should see the cycle repeating. But the toxic bond has completely warped her reality. She convinces her heart this time will be different. She envisions them running toward a shared future, ignoring the grim fact they are just fleeing his criminal fallout. When she quietly agrees to his terms, the scene fades on her sealed fate. It leaves us with a haunting truth. The most dangerous lies we will ever face are the ones we actively beg other people to tell us. In a tragic effort to reclaim her power, Celine tries to establish boundaries. She demands they operate as equals during the trials. Her final rule is a desperate plea, ordering him to fight for his life instead of surrendering. Roman eagerly agrees, parroting her demands back with practiced obedience. He cups her face in the dim light, swearing he will become worthy of her faith. When Celine tearfully jokes she will kill him herself if he dies, Roman lets out a genuine, startling laugh. That rare sound of joy is the final anchor dragging her under the waves. It is a terrifying tactic. By dropping one tiny breadcrumb of pure happiness into a waking nightmare, the manipulator ensures his victim will endure absolute hell just to taste it again. The mental cage is now locked forever. Let us freeze the frame here. You and I, we are witnessing the moment a trauma bond begins to shatter. Before tonight, Celine and Roman survived purely on adrenaline. Look at their exhausted posture, the frantic energy is gone, replaced by a heavy promise. They spend their final hours bleeding out their darkest truths. Roman lays bare the gruesome horror of the syndicate, mapping his guilt. Celine counters by exposing her mental ruins, proving she is no longer a fragile damsel. They bypass romance entirely for raw, surgical honesty. Sitting awake until dawn breaks, they dismantle the toxic secrets that rot relationships from the inside out. The lesson? Sometimes the most profound intimacy is not physical at all. It is simply having the courage to let someone see your ugliest scars. At 6 a.m, federal agents step from the shadows. The romantic illusion is over. Celine watches Roman grab his bag. Notice how his spine goes rigid, bracing for a threat. He pauses at the door. "I love you," he whispers. The words carrying the weight of a dying man. "I love you too," she fires back. "Do not die." The marshals swallow him into the void of protection, leaving Celine in a suffocating silence. She gasps for air, terrified by the 6-month isolation staring her down. Watching the car fade into the mist, she grasps the bitter irony of this salvation. Breaking free means Roman might actually be slaughtered. There is never a safe middle ground when you cut a toxic cord. Sometimes, choosing to heal feels exactly like walking blindfolded into a firing squad. Celine presses her shaking palm against the freezing glass. "Come back to me," she whispers into the quiet room. Portland was supposed to be her safe haven, the place where she could finally glue her broken mind back together. Now it feels like the front lines of a war. She calls Ivy and drops the heavy truth. Roman is testifying against his own father. "You and I have seen people break under less, but..." Celine goes terrifyingly cold. "I need to know how to survive out there," she demands, grabbing her heavy coat. Ivy hears that sharp steel in her voice and agrees, but offers a dark warning. Roman's father is losing his grip on the family, meaning the old rules are dead. The lesson here is simple but brutal. When you back a true monster into a corner, they will gladly set the whole world on fire just to keep their power. The room feels smaller as Ivy spells out the terrifying reality of this choice. If the syndicate spots Celine as his soft spot, they will use her life to silence him. Celine clenches her jaw. She forces down the screaming instinct to pack a bag and run. She pushes out into the freezing rain, letting the shock of the cold water wake up her tired nerves. Most ordinary people freeze completely when they brush up against pure evil. Not Celine. She refuses to become just another quiet tragedy on the sidelines. Marching through the heavy downpour, her stare turns razor sharp. She has exactly 6 months to build a thick layer of mental armor. You can see the takeaway written in the way she walks. When your entire life is collapsing around you, taking a single bold step forward is the only real cure for a paralyzing fear. Deep pain rewires a person from the inside out. We watch Celine shed her old identity as a gentle healer to become a soldier. The naive girl is gone, replaced by a woman who understands that love means nothing without the courage to defend it. Inside the sterile courtroom, she sits perfectly still in the gallery, her face like cold stone. The heavy wooden doors swing open, and Roman is marched inside looking like a hollow shell of himself. His body is entirely worn down by sleepless nights. He is tense and shaking, right up until his frantic eyes lock onto hers. In that tiny fraction of a second, his panic melts into sheer relief. Celine does not smile. Instead, she gives him one slow, heavy nod. It is a silent promise. True loyalty is not found in sweet whispers late at night. It is proven by standing your ground when the hurricane finally hits. Let us step inside that courtroom together. The air feels incredibly heavy as lawyers tear a massive crime family down to the bare wood. Up on the stand, Roman commits the ultimate sin against his own blood. He trades his father's darkest secrets for a deal. The defense attacks him for hours, but Roman just sits there, completely and terrifyingly calm. His voice stays flat as he lists out his own terrible crimes. From the back row, Celine watches his tight shoulders finally drop. He is sweating out decades of poison, picking a painful truth over an easy lie. But this nightmare is not finished. Down in the harsh fluorescent glare of the cafeteria, a heavy hitter for the family traps Celine in a corner. it leaves us with a hard truth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk completely away from the people who raised you. Victor slides into the empty plastic chair across from her, wearing that empty, practiced smile of a true predator. I had to meet the girl who talked Roman into burning down his own house, he says quietly. The bright overhead light catches his dead eyes. He is trying to dump the weight of a ruined crime family squarely on her shoulders. Celine squeezes her paper coffee cup until her knuckles go pure white, but she keeps her chin up. Roman made his own choices, she shoots back. Victor just tilts his head, spinning a sick story about Roman ruining innocent lives. Celine reminds him that those same people drew blood first. Victor leans across the table, his voice dropping. Is this justice or just revenge? The sad reality of life is that a toxic person will always project their own darkness, demanding you carry the heavy guilt for the wreckage they caused. Watch closely as this terrifying dynamic plays out. Victor is a classic predator playing with his food. He casually brings up his own daughter's marriage to Roman, like he is discussing a business deal. When he smiles at Celine, it is just a mechanical twitch. There is zero warmth behind it. Then he drops the real threat. Roman is burning his life down for a girl who will not be breathing long enough to see the smoke clear. Celine forces a brave face, leaning hard into her anger, and basically dares his people to come find her. But pure bravery has a blind spot. The cold lesson here is that a tough attitude does not slow down a speeding bullet. To truly ruthless people, your heartbeat means absolutely nothing. You are just a totally disposable piece on a very dark chessboard, playing a game you never actually signed up for. This is exactly how a real monster operates. Victor does not raise his voice once. He just slowly tightens the mental screws, whispering that she should pack up and disappear. He makes a life of total, lonely isolation sound like her only way out. When Celine fires back that Roman would never drop his morals, Victor lets out a laugh that makes the room feel 10 degrees colder. He knows that Roman's desperate love is the exact thing that will get him put in the ground. Victor promises to use Celine as the blade that cuts Roman's spirit to pieces. When he finally walks away, Celine cannot move a single muscle. The cold coffee shaking in her hands shows her nervous system completely crashing. The lesson is hard to ignore. You can build up thick walls in your mind, but deep, primal fear will always find a tiny crack and rip the whole thing down. The truly tragic thing about deep trauma is how quickly it teaches you to lie to the people you love. Celine swallows the threat and says nothing. Day after day, she sits in that stuffy courtroom, acting as Roman's only lifeline while the lawyers pick his past apart. You can literally see the light dying in his eyes. Then Celine's thin bubble of safety pops. A friend from work quietly mentions that a black car with tinted windows has been following her for 3 straight days. The trap is snapping shut, but she refuses to pack her bags. Staring right at the end of her life, she digs her heels into the dirt. It points to a scary truth about human nature. A shared nightmare creates bonds so incredibly thick that we will gladly stand dead center on the train tracks, watching the bright lights speed right at us without taking a single step back. Ivy steps back into the picture, begging her friend to wake up. She warns Celine that standing in the crosshairs of a major crime family is not some beautiful romance. It is just a death wish wearing the mask of loyalty. But Celine fights back, arguing that her old, quiet life was basically just a fake existence. This is the dark trap of a broken mind, making you believe you actually asked for the cage. As the threats close in, her daily routine turns into a paranoid hell. She changes her drive home every single day. She sleeps with pepper spray on the nightstand, flinching at loud noises. She puts on this huge, draining show of being bulletproof, while her body is vibrating with pure panic. The lesson is simple but heavy. Putting on a tough face and pretending you are fearless is always far more exhausting than just admitting you are scared to death. Stick with me here, because this is the moment the fake safety glass shatters. 6 long months go by. The crime family is completely dismantled, and Roman walks out a free man. They finally meet up under the cloudy skies of a public park, but this is no happy ending. Federal agents watch them from the tree line like caged animals. Roman looks completely drained, a man crushed flat by his own past. He pulls her close and whispers that the worst is over. But Celine knows the ugly truth. Victor is still breathing, and he promised to hunt them to the ends of the earth. She is so worn down by the stress that surviving does not even feel like a victory. Roman knows that witness protection is just a paper bandage covering a very deep wound. The reality here is tough to swallow. Sometimes, running away from the monster just means locking yourself inside a slightly bigger cell. Let us pause and really look at this. The idea of a completely clean slate is just a comforting lie. Roman sits her down and does the cold math. They can take the fake names the government is offering, or they can stay themselves and wait for a hitman to finish the job. The big shift here is that Roman actually gives Celine the power to choose, a basic respect she never got in her past. She sits quietly on the park bench, weighing her entire life. One road lets her keep her own name, the other guarantees decades of checking the rearview mirror for Victor. Roman just stares at the grass, tired eyes begging for one single normal day. No family curses, no looking over his shoulder. You and I might love a thrilling movie, but real life teaches a different truth. True luxury is not money or respect. True luxury is a boring, quiet day where nobody is coming to hurt you. Erasing your own history is a heavy price to pay. Celine fully deletes her old self, following the very man who dragged her into this mess all the way into hiding. The government drops them in a freezing, tiny Colorado town of maybe 8,000 people. Meet Ryan and Sarah. They wear cheap wedding rings and practice their fake history over breakfast. Roman starts working with wood, swinging a hammer all day, just to avoid thinking about the things his hands used to do. Celine takes a quiet job at a local doctor's office, using busy work to quiet her own screaming mind for 3 short months. The terrible ringing in their ears actually starts to fade. They buy milk, they sleep through the night. It is a lovely mirage. But the takeaway is clear as day. You can change your first name and move across the country, but until you deal with the ghosts in your own head, you are really just playing dress up. Look closely at this opening shot, because you and I are about to watch their illusion of safety shatter. Their quiet little bubble pops the second. A stranger walks into Celine's clinic, politely asking for her fake name. The guy looks like a boring professional. Maybe an accountant, but his eyes are totally dead. Celine recognizes the predator hiding right behind that polite smile. He drops the bomb. Victor has already sliced through their federal protection. The syndicate demands a massive payoff within 7 days to keep their secret. When the man finally leaves, Celine simply collapses against the wall, her hands shaking violently. The life lesson here is chilling but true. The monsters from your past do not need to kick down your front door when they already hold all the keys to your new life. The bitter truth they face here is that running from your history merely changes the address of your cage. Victor has turned the witness protection program into a bad joke. Roman pushes through the clinic doors, his broad shoulders bowing under a massive, invisible weight. Celine whispers the new threat. Roman steps outside to make a single phone call. When he returns, his face is ashen, looking like he aged 10 brutal years in minutes. They demand $2 million. Celine calls it extortion. Her voice trembling. Roman, sinking into a cold chair in utter defeat, simply calls it survival. Here is a simple, meaningful lesson you and I must remember. Chopping down the branches of a toxic tree means nothing if the poisoned roots are left to rot in the soil. The camera lingers on the trap closing around them. In this dark underworld, $2 million is never just a transaction. Paying ransom is a permanent brand of submission. Celine and Roman sit bathed in gorgeous afternoon daylight, yet they are suffocating inside a psychological coffin. Pay the extortion, flee into the night, or end up in a ditch. The authorities offer zero salvation against Victor, a predator who lives for the hunt. It breaks your heart to watch the realization dawn in their eyes. The profound lesson here is unavoidable. You can never outrun a nightmare, because your fear is exactly what feeds the beast. You can change your city, but your location means nothing if you stay locked in the mental cage they built for you. Watch the subtle shift in the lighting as Celine rebuilds her mindset. For years her instinct was to flee, believing distance equaled safety. But inside that clinic, the grand illusion shatters. She realizes the crime family is a terminal virus, and her past testimony merely bought a delay. Yet, instead of crumbling, her spine straightens. She meets Roman's desperate gaze and declares she is done running. She refuses to play the perpetual victim anymore. She agrees to wire the money, not as a surrender, but as a cold cost of doing business. The life lesson here is striking. True survival is rarely about discovering a perfectly safe place to hide. Sometimes it is about planting your feet firmly in the danger zone and deciding your life is worth fighting for. Notice how claiming agency becomes her ultimate armor. Celine admits the mark has been on her since Boston, fully owning their messy trauma bond. Confronting the terror is her weapon against helplessness. Roman searches her eyes for panic, but finds only unyielding and stone. They wire the $2 million offshore, fully aware that a sociopath's word is absolute dust. They are merely purchasing a little more sand in the hourglass. Fade in, 6 months later. Celine opens a bright community clinic, forging her nightmares into a sanctuary for the broken. There is a powerful life lesson to carry with us. You cannot always scrub the painted target off your back, but you can absolutely choose what beautiful things you build while standing directly in the crosshairs. This clinic is Celine's quiet rebellion against the Syndicate's empire of death. She wages war on violent predators by healing the defenseless. When Roman steps into the frame, the transformation of this former enforcer is staggering. Celine gently asks if he regrets the ashes they left behind. Roman's voice breaks. He confesses. He only grieves for the decades wasted on his father, a narcissist who poisoned every soul he touched. But here is the climax. Roman does not regret burning his violent kingdom to the ground to hold her. He rebuilt his ruined soul to become a man capable of pure love. The vital life lesson hits hard. The environment you were raised in does not dictate your destiny. You can always choose to walk away from a poisonous legacy, whatever the cost. Let us step behind the lens. Today you and I are going to unpack this tragedy together. Celine always knew safety was an illusion, especially with Vittorio hunting them. The patriarch is a megalomaniac, weaponizing surveillance to mentally shatter his victims. When she asked if the terror would ever fade, Roman's answer was devastating. He admitted the assassins would probably never stop coming, but his solution? Build a breathtaking life anyway. They opened that clinic fully aware. A bullet could shatter the glass at any moment. It was a spectacular rejection of living on their knees. They understood falling in love meant handing the enemy a loaded weapon, but they chose each other regardless. The life lesson is simple. Pure love is the ultimate defiance against the dark. This choice is a desperate clawing at their humanity. Celine's hand finds Roman's. These are the very hands that once tore her life apart, now working to stitch it back together. They drive home, swallowing the bitter bile of survivors' paranoia. The life lesson is haunting. Eventually, the mind must choose fragile trust over endless panic, or madness will swallow you whole. They sit by the fire, murmuring about mundane things like clinic charts. Honestly, that boring whisper is their greatest triumph. The scene darkens when Luca's message illuminates the screen. Celine views his stalking as twisted loyalty, but the tragic truth is Luca is suffocating in Stockholm Syndrome. He is completely paralyzed, unable to sever ties with the monstrous crime family that ruined his existence. The camera catches the twitch in Roman's jaw. He recognizes Luca's sick loyalty instantly, because that exact disease used to run in his own veins. He knows how serving a toxic empire will quietly rot your soul. Beside him, Celine breathes deeply, locking her horrific memories into a mental vault. The brutal trials, the cameras, the smirking narcissist who shattered them. She buries it all. They are performing their own brutal exposure therapy, proving that healing is an exhausting everyday war. Their whispered confessions in the dark are not cheap romance. They are the desperate prayers of survival. They are forcefully rewiring their minds. The beautiful life lesson shines through the gloom. You can always choose to trust the light, even when your dark past begs you to fall. Stick with me, we need to freeze the frame right here. Study this agonizing contrast. Two former pawns of a bloody underworld, waking up to what? Not the crack of a sniper rifle, not the screech of tires, just a scarred man humming a tune, measuring sugar into a mug. For Celine, whose nervous system is hardwired for raids, the profound silence feels physically threatening, yet it is the exact medicine she needs. She pulls on his discarded flannel, a makeshift armor of intimacy, and pads into the kitchen. They stand in the pale dawn light, two haunted ghosts pretending to be ordinary mortals. Their ultimate reward for surviving hell is just the grace of a quiet cup of coffee. The simple life lesson? True peace usually hides in the most mundane, overlooked moments. The camera pans to the rusted junker coughing to life, revealing a bitter cosmic joke. These two once operated in the shadow of a mob boss who treated blood money like pocket change. Now, they commute in a dying car, choosing poverty because the air finally feels clean. Roman hypes up their clinic, acting like a general marshalling troops. But Celine's eyes reflect a wiser truth. You do not save the rotting world, you merely hold space. So a few broken souls feel less invisible. When they pull up, they find absolute chaos, dozens of desperate people shivering in the cold. Celine wades into the suffering without a flinch. Here is a profound life lesson. The truest way to mend your own shattered spirit is to gently bandage the bleeding wounds of others. Focus the lens on Roman behind the flimsy intake desk. Here sits a man bred to inherit a bloody crime family, now gripping a cheap clipboard. playing the part of an ordinary citizen. The contrast is amusing, until the raw tragedy of life kicks the doors open. A terrified girl drags her sibling into the lobby, the child violently gasping for oxygen, an asthma attack. In a fair world, a simple fix. But in this forgotten town, poverty is an execution order. Celine's face turns to unreadable stone. She operates with the precision of a machine. Though her inner child is screaming, she administers the medicine and watches the terrified lungs finally draw a breath. She masks it as routine. The simple life lesson is moving. Sometimes, pulling another soul from the abyss is the only way to pull yourself back. The most agonizing frame arrives when the frantic mother digs through her pockets, bracing for a shakedown. Her shoulders flinch, fully expecting the cruel world to crush her. But Celine just shakes her head. The medicine costs nothing. As the mother collapses into sobs, the real subtext is revealed. Celine is not merely treating a stranger, she is reaching backward through time, catching the terrified girl she used to be. Later they drag their exhausted bones back to their sanctuary. There is no grand victory feast awaiting them. There is just the quiet crackle of Roman building a fire in the dark. It illustrates a truth we all eventually learn. Redemption is rarely a massive spectacle. It is usually found in the quiet, gentle act of sharing a piece of bread with someone you love. Let us step into the room together and watch this scene unfold, because it is quietly devastating. The camera lingers on Roman, the firelight painting deep shadows across his face. He turns to Celine, asking if this piece is real, or if they are just hiding from the monsters who forged them. He used to be a living weapon. Now, he thinks craving a quiet life makes him a coward. Celine crosses the room, grabbing his shoulders with a fierce grip. She tells him that walking away from a violent destiny is never running away. It is finally reclaiming your soul. It is so easy to mistake our familiar cages for our true identities, simply because we know the shape of the bars. But real courage is picking the lock, leaving the darkness behind and daring to step into the warm sun. The camera pushes in close as she locks eyes with him, stripping away his deep guilt. She whispers that craving peace is not cowardice, it is raw, bleeding survival. The heavy tension in Roman finally shatters. He pulls her against his chest, shaking his head at the absolute insanity that they are still breathing. His laugh is heavy, dragging 10 years of buried nightmares from his lungs. As the lights click off, plunging the room into a deep cinematic blue, Celine lies awake. She stares at the ceiling, replaying their narrow escapes. Then the profound revelation hits her. It was never luck they carved this sanctuary with their own torn hands. Healing is never a gentle wave that passively washes over you. It is a brave choice you must wake up and fight for every single day. Let us pause the frame right here. You and I running away from violence is simple, compared to the terrifying ordeal of learning to trust. Broken people often stay broken, simply because the familiar dark feels safer. Trusting someone is handing them a loaded weapon and praying they lower the barrel. The film jumps 3 years forward, the lighting suddenly bright and warm. Celine stands on a public stage, accepting an award without any camouflage, no fake names, no shadows to hide in. The beautiful tragedy of love is that it leaves your chest exposed to a fatal strike. But if you lock your heart away just to survive, you turn yourself into a living ghost, dead before you ever fall. They understood the heavy risks of being truly seen, and they bravely chose to embrace life anyway. The camera blurs the mayor, his voice fading to an empty drone. The lens pulls focus to Celine, whose eyes are fully anchored to Roman. The visual shift in his character is staggering. He used to sit in dark rooms like a coiled serpent, ready to end a life now. The heavy armor of paranoia has melted from his shoulders. Next to him sit Ivy and Marcus, lethal ghosts playing a quiet suburban family. After Celine accepts the plaque, the real emotional beat hits backstage. Roman leans in, his voice a soft rumble, whispering how genuinely proud he is. Celine gently shakes her head, reminding him they poured this solid foundation together. It is a vital reminder that true partnership means carrying the weight as one, sharing our quiet victories just as deeply as our lingering pain. Roman does not miss a beat. He whispers she saved him first. The unspoken memory hangs between them, recalling the rain-slicked night when he dragged his torn body into her emergency room. Celine smiles, her eyes shining. It feels like a dark tragedy starring two different people. She touches his scarred face, swearing she would not trade a single agonizing second. That river of blood led them straight to this hour. He pulls her in, kissing her deeply while the town erupts into applause to Celine. The cheering sounds like fate finally surrendering. Later that night, his heavy hand rests gently on her stomach, For the first time in years, her mind does something miraculous. It stops bracing for a violent attack. We realize that true peace is always the quietest victory of all. Pay close attention to this beat in the shadows of their room. Roman softly asks what she's thinking about. Celine turns and casually detonates a psychological bomb. She wants a baby. The camera focuses on Roman as the hardened enforcer turns to absolute stone. You can watch his nervous system short-circuit. The silence stretches, thick and suffocating. When he finally speaks, his voice fractures. He confesses he never once envisioned a future that did not end in a bloody grave. A family was a myth for someone like him. Yet he looks at her, eyes shining in the dark, and whispers that he wants to try. It teaches us that no matter how deep our trauma runs, the human soul remains desperate to nurture and create. They fall asleep holding on tight, finally daring to believe in a happy ending. 6 months pass and fate delivers its quiet verdict. 2 stark lines on a test, the camera frames Celine on the cold bathroom tiles, consumed by blinding joy and suffocating terror. The shadow of Vittorio, the mobster who swore to destroy her, flickers through her mind, but she breathes deep, forcing the fear back into its cage. It is a powerful reminder that we must never let old ghosts dictate our happiness. When she hands Roman the test that evening, the scene reveals pure vulnerability. This enforcer, a man who never blinked at a loaded gun, completely shatters. Heavy tears carve down his scarred face as he pulls her close, repeating the words like a prayer. He is absolutely terrified, yet for the very first time in his violent life, he is hopelessly and beautifully happy. Freeze the frame right here. They should be basking in the joy of new life. But Celine is constantly scanning shadows, convinced the violence of Boston will find them. The lighting stays intensely oppressive. Every clinic visit feels like a psychological war zone. Roman acts as her anchor, absorbing her panic while waiting for Vittorio to strike. But here is the bleak irony of fate. They spent 8 months bracing for a catastrophic war, and the legendary kingpin Vittorio, he does not fall in a blaze of bullets. His cruel heart simply stops beating in his sleep, a pathetic, unremarkable biological failure. All that terror was wasted on an old man quietly expiring in the dark. It proves that sometimes the terrifying monsters we fear the most just naturally fade into nothingness on their very own. Let us observe Luca, because his tragedy demands pity. He is severed from the mob, yet he lingers like a ghost, guarding the syndicate that kept a collar around his neck. It is a haunting picture of trauma bonding, but Luca delivers the saving grace. The new regime has no interest in ancient blood feuds. The invisible noose finally dissolves. 2 weeks later, the film erupts into glorious chaos as Celine goes into labor. Watch the brilliant contrast here. Roman, a man who once orchestrated assassinations with a flat pulse, is white-knuckling the steering wheel. He speeds through the night, drowning in genuine panic. It reveals a beautiful, terrifying truth of human nature. The thickest emotional armor completely disintegrates, the exact second you finally get something truly precious to lose. Celine glances from the passenger seat, gripping the dashboard through a brutal contraction, and actually laughs. She gasps that he was supposed to be the steady one, while Roman practically sweats through his clothes. It is a breathless release of tension. The camera cuts to the soft hospital lights at 3:47 in the morning, capturing the birth of their daughter. They name her Hope. It is no empty cliché. Hope was the gritty force that kept them fighting when surrendering would have been so much easier. When Roman cradles that fragile life, the last shadow of the mobster physically melts from his jawline. He whispers a desperate vow to forever shield her from the terrors of his past. This powerfully proves that our most violent, broken chapters never have to dictate our final ending. The timeline shifts 5 years ahead, framing a poetic irony. Celine, who once flinched at shadows, now commands a medical empire. Roman stands beside her, balancing little Hope on his hip, while their son tugs at Celine's coat. The camera catches the same defiant fire in the boy's eyes that his father once used for war. Roman surveys the beautiful chaos of their life, turns to his wife, and speaks with quiet reverence. He tells her she completely rewrote the tragic script the world tried to force upon them. She took their shattered pieces and forged pure gold. We are often told that severe trauma defines us forever, but this story proves otherwise. We are never permanent hostages to our circumstances. We all possess the power to build a beautiful new life directly over the ashes of our violent past. The camera pushes in on Roman as he watches his children, a profound realization washing over his face. For a man programmed for violence since childhood, lasting peace feels dangerously like a trap. He truly believed his blood-stained hands disqualified him from salvation. But Celine laces her fingers through his, a physical reminder that they dragged themselves through hell to earn this quiet life. Later, a wide shot frames them on the porch under a vast night sky. We can either let our scars turn us cruel, or use them to build a safe haven. The past is only a cage if we absolutely refuse to open the door. Yet, just as the scene fades into the tranquil dark, Roman shatters the quiet with the one question that still haunts the frame. Do you ever think about Boston? Stick with me, because we need to unpack this beautifully twisted dynamic. Celine sips her wine, casually admitting she misses the chaotic rush of the emergency room. That raw craving for adrenaline is exactly why she belongs with a former mob boss. The lighting shifts cold as Roman pulls out a letter from the federal government. His father's criminal syndicate has been wiped out, and they are actually thanking him. But look at Roman's vacant expression. He feels absolutely nothing. Annihilating his bloodline was never a heroic crusade. It was a calculated slaughter to ensure no one could ever threaten Celine again. Sometimes the right thing is done for the most selfish reasons imaginable, and you simply have to learn to live with the ghosts you created. Watch how masterfully Celine rewires the narrative. When Roman wonders if his dark motives poison their happy outcome, she hands him an emotional shield. She reframes the destruction of a criminal empire as a win for the world, completely ignoring why he actually pulled the trigger. She takes his ruthless betrayal and compares him to a mother bear protecting her cubs. It is a staggering display of mental gymnastics to justify loving a killer, but it works flawlessly. Roman pulls her close, clinging to her, like a drowning man to a life raft. Her acceptance is the only tether keeping his mind intact. It leaves us with a heavy truth. True love is not about finding a perfect partner. It is about finding someone who looks directly at your darkest sins and still decides you are worth saving. A decade slips away inside their isolated bubble, but fate always demands a toll. An invitation arrives for Celine to speak at a medical conference in Boston, the absolute ground zero of her trauma. The camera lingers on her trembling fingers as she almost tears the paper. Roman steps from the shadows, resting a hand on her shoulder to push her toward the fire. He insists she must face the city to prove that terrified nurse is finally dead. When she steps off the plane, Boston hits her like a physical blow. The freezing wind bites her cheeks, the gray streets instantly suffocating her. Facing your deepest demons is rarely pretty, but avoiding them forever means they secretly own you. You have to force yourself to walk right back into the dark, just to prove that you can still survive the light. You and I have to appreciate the cruel irony framing this scene. After a flawless presentation, Celine wanders down the freezing street like a sleepwalker. Muscle memory drags her to the exact hospital where her old life violently ended. Standing alone under a flickering street lamp, watching the frantic nurses, a realization hits her. The old Celine was just a hostage trapped in permanent panic. The new Celine took that exact bleeding trauma and forged an empire. But just as she exhales and turns to leave, fate throws a brutal punch. She collides directly with Dr. Reeves, a walking ghost pulled from her darkest nightmare. Life has a funny way of testing you just when you finally feel safe. It always throws your past right back into your face, simply to see if you still flinch. In that suffocating conversation with Reeves, Celine stares her tragic past dead in the eye. When he mentions the bloody night she vanished, the camera flashes to Roman bleeding out on her table. But here is the beautiful twist. Her pulse never races. She feels no terror. That horrific night is no longer a nightmare. It was the painful spark she needed to escape a hollow life. By declining his offer and calmly walking away, she shatters the final chain. Touching down in Colorado, she spots Roman and the kids waiting at the gate. The warm visual contrast is breathtaking. When asked about Boston, she only smiles. The monster under the bed is gone. You cannot change the terrible things that happened to you, but you always retain the power to completely rewrite what those memories mean. Let us frame this quiet victory. The lighting softens as Celine confesses that the terrified woman she used to be feels like a complete stranger. When Roman asks if she visited that haunted hospital, she delivers the ultimate proof of healing. She felt absolutely nothing. No crippling panic, no tears, just a cold, empty brick building. That is what true closure looks like. You do not forget the bleeding. You just stop letting the pain charge you rent later. Swaying together in the dim shadows of their kitchen, they acknowledge how lucky they are. By all the rules of this dark tragedy, they should both be buried. Instead, Roman pulls her close, promising they will build this life every single day. His violent predator drive is now completely weaponized to protect his family. As you and I close the file on Roman and Celine, the camera slowly pulls back. Outside their window, the jagged mountains are swallowed by the freezing dark, but inside, bathed in warm light, sit two deeply broken people who consciously choose to trust each other instead of tearing the world apart. True survival is never just about dodging the initial gunshot. It is the million tiny choices you make every single day to not let the shadows pull you under. Celine started this tragic story as a helpless hostage, weeping in the back of a car. She ends it as the fierce architect of her own fate. The greatest thing a human being can do is not simply surviving the fire. It is standing barefoot in the smoldering ashes and actively choosing to build a life that is worth fighting for.
One of the most inspiring parts of Celine's journey is how she turns suffering into service. After losing Roman and fleeing Boston, she could have allowed pain to make her bitter. Instead, she works at a free clinic, helping people who have nowhere else to go. Later, with the foundation funding, she builds clinics that serve communities in real need. This transformation is deeply meaningful. Celine is a nurse, but her healing work is not only medical. She understands what it feels like to be abandoned, frightened, and without support. That emotional knowledge makes her more compassionate toward people who are also struggling. Her pain does not make her weaker. It makes her more human. The educational lesson is that suffering can either close our hearts or deepen them. We cannot always choose what hurts us, but we can choose what we build from it. Celine chooses to build care, access, and safety for others. The clinic becomes a symbol of her new life. It proves that she is no longer only the woman Roman hurt. She is a healer, a leader, and a builder. She creates something that matters beyond romance, beyond revenge, beyond survival. This is important for viewers, because many people feel lost after heartbreak or trauma. They may think their pain has ruined them. Celine's story says that pain can become fuel for purpose. The same wound that nearly breaks you can teach you how to see the wounds of others. Her clinics show that the best form of healing is not forgetting what happened. It is using what happened to become more compassionate, more useful, and more courageous. Celine saves herself by helping others survive too.